Thank you so much. Just looking at the chat box, welcome colleagues from Pakistan. Again, hello and a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of UNDP. My name is Naja Hashimi. I'm the Electoral Policy Specialist with UNDP's Office for the Middle East and North Africa. I'm in Amman, Jordan. It is now 5 o'clock here. I'm your moderator for this series on the impact of the virus on elections. This is our 7th in the series, and we're happy to report that we've reached around 800 participants through Zoom and tens of thousands on Facebook and YouTube. The webinars have allowed for a two-way discussion between speakers and participants, both of whom come from the global election community. We've had the privilege of hearing from the experiences of countries that held elections during the current crisis, with practical examples that they have provided on what they have done and what they can do better. We also heard from countries that have had to postpone elections and those that are still in the process of taking a decision one way or the other. We've also had partners who joined and contributed to the learning and sharing through this platform, including our friends from Arab EMBs and International IDEA. In the most recent webinar, we shifted the focus to electoral assistance and looked at how the pandemic is impacting the work of assistance providers on the ground, with a feature on the UN detailing the role of our electoral assistance division in New York and UNDP supporting member states on the ground. If you missed any of those discussions, you can watch the recordings on our YouTube channel. What we know now about the virus and how it's transmitted is not what we thought we knew necessarily at the start of this series. Our knowledge of what we are able to do as election practitioners and experts is evolving as our knowledge of the virus evolves. The context is continuously changing, and today we will look at another important electoral stakeholder that is affected by these changes. These are election observers. We know that election observers can serve as a deterrent to potential fraud and manipulation. They can help build public confidence in the electoral process. They can help promote and protect civil and political rights, and their work can lead to addressing weaknesses in the process, sometimes even during an election. And at the national level, observer groups help encourage civic participation in the political process. The objectives and goals of election observers are modest, but they are important. They provide accurate and impartial reporting on the quality of elections, and they demonstrate the interest of the international community and civil society in elections and in the democratization process. We all know that election observation can take on heightened importance in such challenging times as we have today with the pandemic. In such cases, observations can make an important contribution to conflict prevention, peace building, and help promote reconciliation and sound democratic practices. This is why today we feature representatives from leading and active election observation groups to help us better understand how the pandemic is affecting election observation, the role of it in effectiveness of observers, and the impact on their organization in general. How are they able to cope with restrictions to movement? How do these restrictions and the need to ensure health safety affect the size of observer missions, the size of teams deployed to any one location? With the restriction to air travel, is there a greater focus on domestic observation? Are they doing more of the analysis remotely? And does the move to online and remote work make collaboration and information sharing with other groups easier? Today's discussion will also touch on what observers are paying attention to as they assess elections and the electoral environment during a pandemic. What are their concerns of the impact the virus has and the risks of legitimate health concerns being used in ways that can undermine election integrity? We are grateful to our speakers for taking the time to join us today and for contributing to the learning and sharing that this platform enables. Our speakers are joining from Cairo and Manila, and we encourage you to interact with them and with each other via the chat box by sharing your comments and questions. Each of our panel members will speak for 10 minutes before we open to a 45-minute Q&A session. Again, we are offering this webinar in Spanish, French, and Arabic. Osama has provided instructions. He will also post this in the chat on how you can access them if you missed the introduction at the beginning. Panel members, thank you again for being here. You have a mixed audience here today with us. You have electoral authorities and practitioners. You have UN and non-UN electoral experts. You have civil society representatives, including youth groups from around the world. You have regional international organizations working in the field of elections. They are joining to hear how the pandemic is affecting your work as election observers. I would like to turn to our first speaker, Ms. Hadia Hassan Sabri. She is with the League of Arab States. She's their top person on elections. The League was formed in 1945 and has 22 member states covering the Middle East and North Africa region. Ms. Sabri is director of the League's Electoral Assistance Division, Electoral Affairs Department. She's leading a department that is primarily focused on election observation within the members of the Arab League. She has extensive experience working with LAS and in elections. She's taken part in numerous efforts this week in observing Senate elections in Cairo. This is where she joins us from. Cairo has at least COVID, and today was the second day of elections, I understand. Hadia, we are very grateful that you took the time out. I know this is a very busy day for you. Thank you for being here today and sharing your experience. Over to you.
شكرا ناجية، شكرا أستاذة هدى. الحقيقة أن أنا يسعدني أن أنا أنضم.
Actually, I'm very happy to join you in these webinars, and I would like to thank all the organizers of these webinars that help us to find alternatives for the electoral processes and to develop it in such circumstances of COVID-19. And how to overcome those challenges facing the electoral process and observers included. Actually, I will give you a background about what you're doing. The League of Arab States started its work with the start of 90s with the increase of the elections in the Arab region, and the administration was established in 2003, but till 2014. The administration was established in 2013, but between 2004 and 2018, the LAS had a lot of requirements for the Arab countries and even non-Arab countries, which was the demands of many Arab countries to have observation or observers for the elections or memorandums or surveys. So the LAS has a number of countries, a lot of them are Arab countries and some other non-Arab, and it sends a lot of missions to observe elections, whether they're parliamentarian or presidential or surveys. The administration is divided into two, the management of elections and international cooperation, and the other part supporting the elections. Of course, monitoring the elections is international monitoring, whether in Arab countries or non-Arab countries with different kinds, but the other part is still not activated, and it is the part of delivering technical support, especially in the countries that are still in the process of establishing their structure. And this is done according to demands and requests by the countries. And currently, we have a high level of training. We have 23 trainers, accredited official trainers, or partially accredited, that can support or deliver training workshops that would develop and improve the elections in Arab countries or in different countries. This is a quick idea about the administration, and now I will talk about the observation and the effect of COVID-19 on elections. And undoubtedly, the COVID-19 affected a lot of countries, the whole world, whether politically, economically, socially, and among the things that were affected is the electoral process in a lot of countries of the world. And despite, and nevertheless, a lot of countries conducted their elections, like France, Southern Korea, Lithuania, and Russia had their constitutional survey, but it wasn't done in a normal way. There were some precautionary procedures, very strict, due to the fear of COVID-19 and the spread of the virus on the citizens and on the workers. The international organizations and even the local organizations that observe the elections issued some decisions regarding the inability to observe elections, like these restrictions of flights from the countries that these organizations are based at, to the countries that are having the elections. Even the national organizations, there were also some concern about their participation or contribution to the electoral process. The last lately received an invitation from the National Authority for Elections, Egyptian Authority for Elections, a request to observe the Senate elections, Senate Council election. And, they conducted elections at the 9th of August outside Egyptian, and here inside Egypt we had our elections yesterday and today. It starts 10 a.m. and it ends I think she said at 12 or 10 p.m. with a very hot climate. That's why this also consisted another challenge for elections, that the elections are being conducted in such circumstances, but we had to do so that we can establish a balance that we need, and also can achieve the decisions that were taken, the constitutional decisions that were taken to have the parliament. And that's why the League of Arab States had to go through the experience of observing elections with such circumstances of COVID-19, and it had a lot of impact, and we will have lessons learned from this experience. So it observes elections in the situation of COVID-19. I would like to say that the National Authority or Administration for Elections in Egypt conducted elections in very difficult circumstances. Last Sunday and Monday was for expatriates and outside Egypt, and today is for our citizens here. We had taken a lot of strict procedures to maintain the health of the citizens and the electoral workers. So the electoral authority had a very big challenge. Just like I said, they needed to implement the decisions that were taken by the constitutional reforms in 2018. For the League of Arab States, we had a big challenge to establish the teams. Like, for example, in the observation missions, usually we had a lot of members of observers, and it was decided based on number of criteria, like the population, the size of population, and also the geographic area that we are observing at. But Corona actually affected the observation missions, so there was a lot of concerns to participate in those missions and to observe the Senate elections. They were very concerned, just like anybody, like it's during the movements between the centers, polling stations. God forbid it, anyone could get infected, because we have a lot of citizens, a lot of people, places are crowded, so this affected the observation missions. Also, another of the challenges is that we got rid or abandoned using the papers and abandoned using the tablets, while sometimes we had to use the tablets in some of the countries. Also, we had another challenge, which was we couldn't also observe elections outside Egypt, sorry, and that's why the electoral authority in Egypt updated a new method, like using the fast mail, and the voter can open an account on the site of the National Authority for Elections and submit his or her data and print out the papers that he wants to fill in, showing that he is willing to vote, and then to send it by the mail to the embassies of Egypt, and to be sent then to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is not considered a normal way of voting, so that's why it was difficult to observe it. Also, COVID-19 affected the number of polling stations that the observers needed to visit throughout all the days of the election, and this also will affect the observation of the Senate elections. Also, the observation missions could conduct meetings with the stakeholders of the electoral process, because a lot of those stakeholders were concerned of the spread of COVID-19. So that's why those meetings were conducted too soon. And of course, this wouldn't be just like regular meetings, physical meetings. It's different than virtual meetings. Also, the commitment of the observers with the procedures like wearing masks, gloves, and continuous sanitation with such high temperatures, and this caused the fatigue, and the observer gets exhausted easily and cannot continue working for 12 hours. As for the huge challenges that the authority faced, the electoral campaigns, because it made it obligatory for all the candidates to conduct their campaigns through virtual meetings or virtual campaigns, and through also social media and the TV and broadcasting. And this also limited the programs, the electoral programs of the candidates. Also, social distancing during the campaigns. It wasn't a normal campaigns and the way we know it during the electoral process. Also, voting through mail outside Egypt, this is also considered a first-time experience, and it was decided within the procedures taken by the authority to maintain the health of the voters and to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This also decreasing number of voters in each polling station or polling center, and also to increase the number of polling centers. So in two ways, decreasing the number of voters in each voting or polling center, and at the same time increasing the centers so that the voters wouldn't be crowded in one place. They also provided sanitizers, gloves, masks, so anybody going inside those centers and not wearing a mask should get one, and once he entered, his or her hands need to be sanitized and need to go through the automatic sanitizer. And this is to maintain the health and the safety of the members of the committees and also the citizens themselves. They also worked on sanitizing the offices once in the morning and another time in the afternoon. So if there's anything, it would be contained. And there was an employee that was assigned to make sure of the social distancing between the voters and also to organize people. Like today, we had some committees in some polling stations. We observed the necessity of keeping the 1.5 meters between one voter and another. We had an employee telling people, no, please step backward, keep the distance between you and you. So they exerted a lot of effort. Also, it made it obligatory to wear masks for all all the members of the committee. Like in each polling station, there's a judge or the head of the committee, the members of the committee. All of them are wearing masks. Each one of them is sitting away from the other. So they had strict regulations. Also, not to use the indelible ink because this ink could be carrying the infection from one person to another. Also, the registry, when any person enters having his ID, what I saw this time, that the registries, they have the name and the ID. Other than that, they have 2 numbers at the end. If they are missing, they make sure once this person enters there, they look at it. So there wouldn't be any chance for fraud or any duplication for voting. So I think I've seen the Cooperation and Security Organization in Europe in the elections of Serbia. They had a big challenge observing the elections. They sent their observers, those who are living in Serbia. They asked them to do the observation, and this is a kind of solution, so they can practice their duties in the circumstances of COVID-19. Of course, in such circumstances, we need to understand the situations and to try to find solutions for these challenges. To conduct elections or the electoral process can be conducted in an organized way or acceptable way. The last thing that I want to say, we need to change the culture of people, try to change our culture so we can accept the e-voting, the remote voting, online voting, and all of these. So it seems that whether we like it or not, we are going to have such alternatives. So the culture of people need to accept such a new thing or in new ways. And not to say that it is unacceptable and it is not credible. No, we need to be open-minded so we can accept such changes. I know, I don't know if I exceeded my time or what. I would like to thank you in the end. And today, by the way, we had a lot of, a long day observing the elections. We were in the field, and I don't want to tell you about the temperatures. It's true that the turnout is not that high, but despite Corona, despite that it is month of leaves or vacations, but nevertheless, the authority on having these elections, and because this is the second chamber of the parliament, and in November we will have the parliamentarian elections. So we had to implement the indications that, or the decisions that were taken in 2018. Thank you, everybody. And I'm going to be here for you for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hadia. I know you had a very tough couple of days, and I'm sure you have a couple more days of hard work. The weather is hot in Cairo, so to have conducted an observation in the midst of the pandemic and in that weather, bravo to your team as well. We already have questions coming in for you, but I'll save them for our Q&A session. We will go to our second speaker. So unfortunately, we have lost a speaker, Carlos Pimentel. We're not able to locate him. So we will go to our next speaker, who is in Manila. But before that, just going to the chat box to welcome colleagues from GIZ Zimbabwe, from Mexico. Welcome colleagues from SADC. It's great to have you here. So our next speaker, it's his 10 p.m. So we really appreciate that he stayed up to be part of this discussion. Mr. Damasco Magbol is an active member of civil society. He's a former professor and a retired corporate executive. He's best known for his work with the Asian Network for Free Elections, ANFREL, where he served as a chairperson and currently is its spokesperson. He's been part of many regional national and international civil society groups. He's also served as the first chairperson of the Global Network of Domestic Election Monitors. His experience in election observation is too extensive to list, but suffice to say, he's monitored and observed many elections, particularly in Asia-Pacific region. I met Dami first over a decade ago in Bangladesh, where he was supporting election efforts for electoral authorities in the SARC region. Good evening, Dami. I hope your connection is better. Thank you again for being here. I will pass over to you now. We are a bit flexible with time. I know I told you 10 minutes, but feel free if you want to take a few extra minutes today.
Thank you, Nadia. Can I be heard?
You could be heard, but you can also turn on your video if you like. It would be nice to see you.
Okay, so all right, fine. There is not the video. It says,
For all of our participants.
all right, you can see me already. I'm sorry. I had an interruption in my internet connection. I was so worried I'll miss you, you know. But anyway, good evening to all from Manila. UNFREL is an organization of organizations. So we are a regional organization based in Bangkok. We are found in 22 countries in Asia. As a regional organization, we were not able to observe any election because of travel restrictions. Different countries have different rules, protocols to be observed, which makes it difficult. But our member organizations, they were able to observe 3 elections. One in Sri Lanka last August 5, another one only last August 9 in Bangkok, Thailand. This is a by-election. And sometime in April in Taiwan, also by-election. Often, I should say, that the challenges that election observers face in a pandemic is very similar to those faced by the election management body. Foremost of which is, how do we keep our observers safe in the midst of a serious health problem as they perform their critical role to observe elections, to promote transparency and electoral integrity in the electoral process. So that's the challenge. We all know as election observers that election observers perform their tasks parallel to that of the election management body. He goes through a series of steps and stages referred to as the electoral cycle. From the moment the election observer, I'm distracted by this handsome looking guy. From the moment the election observer Okay, I'm having problems. All right, I get it. From the moment the election observer, for instance, goes through an assessment of the legal framework, go to the different stages, you have the pre-election, the election day, and the post-election. Election observers monitor and look after each stage side by side with the election commission. Now, the most critical or risky phase of the electoral process, which has the highest potential for contamination, is concerned on election day. Why? On election day, the observer interacts with the greatest number of people. Poll workers, voters, media personnel, candidates and their supporters, etc. So the greater the contact with people, the greater the risk for contamination of the virus. Here, on election day, it is necessary to take the safety measures that have to be followed. A government agency such as the Ministry of Health may issue guidelines to be observed. In some cases, it is the election managed body in consultation with the health ministry that issue the guidelines. For instance, in the last election we observed in Sri Lanka on August 5th, the Sri Lankan election managed body issued what they call health guidelines for conducting elections amidst the COVID outbreak. This was, of course, drafted in consultation with the Ministry of Health. Now, speaking as an Asian, I ask the question, should elections be held during a pandemic? Our answer to that here is, as shown by South Korea, which successfully conducted its election near perfection, as they call it, with not a single case traced, contamination traced to the election itself. The reason for that here is we have to hold our officials, rulers accountable. In the ASEAN region, this is Southeast Asia, for instance, rulers that have authoritarian tendencies, such as those in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, they tend to use the pandemic as a means to entrench themselves further in power, so that there is what you call repression of fundamental freedoms and rights. In the Philippines, for instance, you most probably have read about the celebrated case of Maria Ressa, a journalist that's known worldwide, or for that matter, the closure of the biggest TV network in the Philippines, the ABS-CBN. That was done during the pandemic when everybody's talking about the COVID, about contamination. They were making all these sorts of reports on that. Similarly, in Thailand, you may have observed that there were so many arrests made against protesters asking for constitutional reform and bring more democracy. So here, during the pandemic, they avail of the difficulties or the problem, the situation, to enact laws that will further perpetuate themselves in power. Now, from what we've observed, it is not as scary as some may think to observe elections in a pandemic. It's not really, because the pre-election period, you can always maintain what we call the necessary safeties, such as when you go to a candidate, you can maintain the distance, you can have the sanitation, you can have face masks, etc. So the same thing when you observe a rally, if there is any, because it's difficult during these days. So similarly, it's not. Now, we can have, instead of, it's difficult now to deploy a massive number of observers because of what I said, travel restrictions. So what can be done? What we did, for instance, in Nepal, not during the pandemic, but it can be done during a pandemic, is to have what you call a focused observation. Focused observation means you select a specific cycle of the electoral process based on a need of the country. For instance, in Asia, most of our focus observation has something to do with, one, campaign finance. Why? very few laws have campaign finance. Very few countries have campaign finance laws in Asia. You have South Korea, you have Taiwan, you have Japan, and there are some countries that have simply spending limits laws, but not a comprehensive finance, campaign finance law. So they can do that. It is a meaningful activity, and it requires less manpower. It requires less cost and expenses, considering that during pandemic, I'm sure most of the other domestic or citizen organizations observing elections, they are experiencing problem sourcing funds for their operations. Here, this is a meaningful project that can be accomplished without much cost. Now, in between elections, we also have activities. You have to have activities between elections. How will you keep your volunteer? How will you have them involved and engaged for the next election? Maybe they have to be engaged in meaningful activities. I'll cite you an example. Only last week or 2 weeks ago, the Nepal Law Society, which is a member of UNFREL, held what you call a virtual town hall meeting. There, members of parliament participated, retired justices participated, election observers, we have 2 members there. You also have the academics. They discussed, for instance, proposed constitutional amendments that shall be presented to Parliament for action and to be subsequently submitted to the people or to the voters for a plebiscite. Now, in Asia, for instance, we had 5 countries that had elections. There were 5 countries that postponed. And there are 2 countries that will hold it on schedule, namely Mongolia and Myanmar. I ask a question. What if elections are postponed? What are the basic principles that should be observed? First, if an election is postponed, it must be consistent with the legal framework. Most election laws have in their constitution, or in most countries have in their constitution, or in their election laws, the provisions for postponement. In our law, for instance, in the Philippines, it says when there are disasters or crises brought about by acts of nature, force majeure, then the election body can act to postpone the elections. But the law has not contemplated what happens in a pandemic where there was a widespread case of disease, such as we are having now. This is one factor, I think, that should be looked into in future amendments to election laws, because this is not going to be the first. So it has to be consistent with the legal framework. Secondly, it has to have broad-based support among the various stakeholders, meaning to say that the candidates, the political parties are all in agreement that they should postpone the elections. A third condition should be it must have trust of the public. In other words, the public must be made aware of the reason or reasons why the election is postponed, so that they're convinced it was not meant simply to prolong the terms or the, the tenure of incumbent officials. So that's the third. And finally, when you postpone, the postponement must not be open-ended. There must at least be a date in the future where you agree or where the stakeholders will agree that the elections will be held. Here, you need the advice and the opinion of health experts. You may be familiar with the University of Washington, which makes projections as to when the pandemic in a given area will flatten out, as they said, or will have less cases. Similarly, in our case, for instance, the University of the Philippines made projections that have so far been very, very accurate. When they said we will reach 40,000 cases, we did. On the date they said. When they said that we will hit 150,000 by end of August, oh, we are already 140 cases, so they will again meet their projection. So that, in short, are the principles that should be guided. And I just wanted to be very brief, just select a few items, and then I think we can share in the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dami, and on touching the substance of what's happening on the ground and how observers can see the implications of some of the decisions that policymakers are taking, and for giving us sort of a snapshot of what's happening there in the Philippines. Thank you very much. I will now move to our Q&A session. There are questions coming in from colleagues through the chat box and through our Facebook and through private messages. I'll first turn to Hadia because the questions came in for her first. You on the observations you did in Egypt. A question on whether you have developed specific manual or procedures for observation during the pandemic.
The manual is going to be issued for, yes, she's inquiring if this is what we meant, a manual in the pandemic period for elections.
هذه السؤال كان هل الجامعة العربية عملت أي لا دليل للobservation خلال
yes, a manual for the
يعني
observation during the pandemic. Yes, we can have or we can issue a manual about some of the procedures that we have taken within our contribution, the observation for the Senate election, the Senate Council elections, so that any country that may have elections in the future, they can use it. And we had an experience, and we were very much in direct touch with the authority, and we saw what they were doing, and we can have all our observations, all our experience, how we could overcome those challenges. And also we will have some other challenges and problems that we may not have or we may not have had in the previous experience. But this manual could help any other country that is going to have elections, because it's very obvious that the pandemic is going to continue for longer time. So we need to have solutions or alternatives for those challenges and to overcome them, because it's not right that all countries are going to cancel or delay their elections. This is not a democratic solution, of course. So we need to have other solutions. So we can issue a manual, and we will find a way to distribute it everywhere in all the countries of the world.
Hashimi, can I say something? Can I say something? Yes. UNFREL has a set of guidelines for their observers when they go to observe an election. On the other hand, like in the case of Sri Lanka and Thailand, is the election management body that issued guidelines. It was an 18-page that was published in the official gazette of Sri Lanka, what to observe from the finding of certificates of candidacies till the last activity. So the guidelines to maintain health and protocols for safety is observed. In Thailand, it was the Ministry of Health that issued the guidelines to be observed. But like I said, as far as our observers are concerned, we think of their safety. We have our own protocols that should govern the observers.
Thank you. Maybe this is probably available on your website, Anfrel?
Yes, yes, it is. It's there.
So our audience can find more details there. I'll go back to Hadia. Two more questions on the process in Egypt. There's a question on why in Egypt they decided to have elections over several days. And then another question to detail what you mentioned as the quick voting process, the mail-in voting, how that worked in more detail and how it ensured the secrecy of the vote.
I can answer the other question or the second question before the first one. We couldn't follow up the voting of Egyptians outside Egypt because, just like I said, that was a new way, which is the fast mail voting. And actually, the authority created a video and it was sent to the agencies of foreign affairs to be distributed to the Egyptians, and it showed them how to create account on the site of the authority, and this number given to him is going to be unique, so that each voter have his or her own unique number, and to print out the papers which are going to be filled in, his name, his address, and to choose his candidates and to put it in an envelope, and this envelope to be put in another envelope, and then to be sent by fast mail to be sent to the embassies that follow up on the Egyptians. And we couldn't observe that because it wasn't like ordinary voting, and we couldn't know, and none of our members was there, so we couldn't tell if it was kept confidential or not. We could have other challenges, other problems, because in some countries, like in some interviews we had, we knew that our missions or our teams had some problems because the fast mail is public. So this depends on each country. Each country had their own controls, how to use the fast mail. Some countries had difficulties using fast mail in elections. All of those problems, we are going to know about them when we have the feedback, because it was the first time for all the Egyptians outside. And we are going to have lessons learned that we are going to use to avoid some problems that they have had. The first question was about the elections. Nsito.
The question was.
He's asking about the first question. I forgot it myself.
The question on
yes,
why
yes.
the elections were held staggered over a number of days. What was the reasoning behind that?
Because we had a lot of people, a lot of voters. We have 63 million. So it's impossible that they can vote in one day, one electoral day. Even in the presidential elections, we would have 3 days. So the elections of the Senate, we had to have 2 days. This is one thing. The other thing, in the previous elections, they used to divide the 27 governorates in days, Like, for example, they would say the governorate number 1 and number 10 are going to vote in these 3 days. And after 1 week or several days, we are going to have the governorate 11 till 27. We had a lot of people, a lot of governorates, and we cannot have them all in one day. The Senate House also, it's considered the beginning of their work. The Senate House or Senate Council this time was very much different than before. So the 2 days are hardly enough to vote for the Senate elections.
Thank you so much, Adia. Maybe Jami, if I can ask you the next question.
Yes, may I first answer? South Korea spread out its election because when you spread out the elections, you minimize person-to-person interaction, which is the main source for contamination. So that's how they decongest the polling stations on a given day. Number 2, they had to set aside certain provisions for those that have been infected, those on quarantine, those that are sick. So there are provisions for this. Yes, please, you were about to ask a question, Hashimi.
Oh, thank you for sharing.
Nadia. Yeah.
Yeah, so as you know, we're witnessing sort of increasing challenges on disinformation, hate speech, online harassment, the lack of clear transparency about how online content is managed and generated, and how much is spent on online content. What is sort of the view of the election observer community? How are you adapting to assess and monitor these challenges? Can you reflect a bit on that?
Yes. Misinformation is very, very common during elections. No? What we have done in the Philippines is there is what you call a group of civil society organizations that fact check what is found, what they read on social media, particularly on Facebook, and then these are corrected properly. And at the same time, they advise Facebook so that this could be taken out, specific accounts. This in Sri Lanka, they also created a team of observers dedicated mainly for monitoring hate speech, politics of identity, because they have the problems in the north with the Muslims by reason of the bombing they had the Easter Sunday. So they do that. I'd like to inform in the body that they can, if you go to the Kofi Annan Foundation, there is there is a study made by the Electoral Integrity Committee, of which I'm one of the 12 members of that, no? Which says that observing elections in the digital age, and it answers for this, it gives provisions how you can counteract hate speech, how you can counteract misinformation. So please go to that. But like I said, as election observers, we can only do so much because that would require manpower. But we go to the most fundamental and basic things by creating a body tasked only to monitor this and then correct them. That's what we are doing. Of course, we partner with media, with the biggest broadsheet and with the second biggest TV network. That's how we did it in the Philippines.
Fantastic, thank you. Maybe one of our colleagues would put the Kofi Annan website link group for colleagues.
Yes.
There's a question. Yeah?
Go ahead, please. Sorry.
That is coming in and on sort of political space. It seems to be shrinking in some places for observers, maybe also in the Philippines. How is this affecting the work of observer groups like yourself?
Relationship between the election body or for that matter, let's face it, election observation is a thankless job. You have many enemies, you have very few friends. That's always the case. However, we are guided by UNFREL. My organization is now 23 years. Through the years, we develop what we call good relationship with the different stakeholders. We have a biannual meeting which is well supported by international organizations like IFS, NDI, IRI, embassies. We call it the Asian Electoral Stakeholders Forum. We meet every 2 years to trace out differences among us. So rarely now do we experience harassment as election observers. We go into constant dialogue. For instance, when they had the elections in 2015 in Myanmar, I visited the election management body 4 times in Naypyidaw, that is very far from Yangon. You have to take the plane, or 4 hours drive if you do that. And only on the 5th meeting did I hear them say, they started to ask questions, we became friends, and they supported us throughout. Number 2, we have a program which we call Editors Guild with, dialogue with Editors Guild, or program with Editors Guild. We train media so that they become our partners. You know, if you have media to your side, that's a very powerful force. But the observation of the questionnaire is very true. The democratic space is shrinking and shrinking, and this is very, very true as well in the Asian countries. With the exception of few like South Korea, is vibrant, Taiwan, Japan, but the emerging democracies, the new or the emerging, the developing countries normally have authoritarian leaders, and they really try to entrench themselves. No? But as election observers, we're not experiencing much difficulty. Unlike in the early days when Marcos was there, oh my God, we had 9 members lost, killed in NAMPREL, my home organization, 158 hurt. You see that. But now, we're getting better. They're being accepted already.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dami. I think this gives a good sort of landscape on where election observation has come over the past 20 years. Definitely it's an accepted and expected element of the electoral process. One of the questions that's coming in from the panelists in the chat box, and I'll also throw this out to both of our speakers, but also to you, Rafael, it's on who essentially decides on the postponement of an election. Is it the electoral body? Is it the government? What is the sort of the global norm or the practice? I'll give it to you, Hadia, first, and then Dami, and then Rafael.
You want to hear from me?
Did the translation work for you, Hadia, or no?
السؤال كان من المسؤول عن اتخاذ قرار التأجيل؟ نعم، تأجيل الانتخابات. نعم، هذا هو السؤال. Yes, this is the question. The electoral body is concerned in all of these actions because it's an independent authority, and the national authority in Egypt is the one responsible, and they take all the decisions from the A to Z, but there should be some consultations. But the one taking the decision is the National Authority for Elections, because it's an authority that has no authority over it, and it's independent, and the decision is taken by it, but it could be in consultation with other agencies and just like in anywhere else, we have constitutional rights that need to be taken, need to be achieved at the time. And just like I said, what happened in the Senate House elections, we had to conduct these elections because that was a decision taken in 2019, and it should have been conducted in the first half of 2020, but due to COVID-19, we delayed it a little, but we had to have the elections in such time. Maybe this wasn't the perfect time for elections, but we needed to conduct it because we are going to have parliamentarian elections. So we had to face this challenge, and we had to have some precautionary procedures. And by the way, the elections was very normal. We have our offices open, and all the thing is that we had to apply some of the precautionary procedures that were taken by the authority. All the precautionary procedures like sanitation, masks, social distancing, the campaigns need to be virtual, not physical, or through some audio, some other procedures. All of them were implemented, and I think the Egyptian experience in this election was great. Maybe, of course, we could have had some problems. This is normal, but in general, it was a good experience and worth mentioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Hadia. Maybe Dami, can you touch on the question?
Yes. If it is, I mean, there are election laws that provide who can postpone the election. For instance, in our case, if you go through the election law of Malaysia, it says there the election commission can postpone the elections. It does not prescribe what reasons it should be. The same thing in Thailand, the same thing in other countries. No, in the event that the law does not define when an election observer, if an election may be held, then it is best to be guided by a consensus of the different election stakeholders. For instance, they must come to an agreement that, one, they're postponing the elections. Two, that these are the grounds by which the election has to be postponed. Three, until these conditions are met, then they shall not. But at the same time, like I said earlier, they must determine a date, more or less, when it can be held, or it can be held again. So it depends. The law may define, the law may not. If it does not, if the law does not define, then there has to be an agreement among the various election stakeholders.
Thanks. Maybe I can ask our resident election guru, Rafael, to also chip in on this question. Osama, can you open Rafael's mic, please?
Well, thank you very much, Nadia. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to be just given a little time on this. As our colleague from the Philippines and the old prestigious and frail organization said, we have to look, first of all, at the law. Then if we look at the politics and the law all together working on this particular issue, it's important to distinguish which kind of electoral authority is in the country. For example, where the electoral authority is still in the executive branch of government, which is the case of most of Europe, some of the Anglo-Saxon countries, especially the United States, the UK. So these are countries where where the electoral authority is the government. Then usually this, at the same time, this system, except the United States, for example, are parliamentary systems. So the elections have to be held every X number of years, normally 4 or 5 years. So in a way, the electoral calendar is in the Constitution, But within those 15 days, the Prime Minister has the privilege to call for elections or postpone elections, anytime, normally until 6 months before the election day. There is the privilege of the executive. And of course, most of the time, this is done as it should be, by consensus or a dialogue between the different political parties. But I'm not sure, for example, if in the case of the UK, that they postpone election for 1 year, not general election, but for 1 year, what kind of negotiation was in parliament. So this is one main factor. Then you have countries, most of the countries in the world now, where the electoral authorities and electoral commission still, in many countries, in Latin America, practically in all countries, the electoral calendar is in the constitution. So any postponement of elections require a special, you look at the law, but in spite of the law, which is not normally including the possibility that an election has to be postponed. They give a calendar and that's it. Then the law specifies that the electoral authority will be calling the election, for example, like in Bolivia, 120 days before the end of the mandate of the incumbents in government. But then if you have a crisis like this of the coronavirus in all countries, and you have a case like Bolivia, where you have an electoral calendar, and then a number of days, but then you have a big political crisis. So this an election was annulled in Bolivia in October, November. There was a social conflict. I mean, there was violence. There was the politicians had to come to an agreement. So it was said, okay, let's make an agreement. The president left the country, and they decided, okay, this is a provisional government. We have 120 days. But then after that 120 days, the Electoral Commission, in negotiations with political parties, parliament and government, they have changed the date 3 times because of the coronavirus and other political reasons. But the coronavirus was the main explicit reason why the election was postponed. So these are the elements one has to take into account. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rafael. The last question that's coming in is on what kind of partnerships are you seeing between health organizations like WHO or national authorities with electoral authorities? Do you see this happening sort of in a systemic way? Is it ad hoc? And how are observers part of this process? Maybe to you, Damas.
Yeah. Normally, you hardly hear election management bodies coordinating with the health ministry in the best of times. They rarely will coordinate or cooperate with each other in doing the elections because the election body works more with, let us say, the Ministry of Education. They need the teachers as poll workers, or they need the security forces, so they have an agreement. But the health ministry, rarely. But in times of emergencies such as the pandemic, then this is again what differentiates elections in a pandemic from the regular elections we have during normal times, where the services of the Ministry of Health suddenly becomes very, very important. So what should be the relationship? Well, it should be one of consultation frequently. But you'll be amazed, South Korea, the NEC of South Korea said they did not work with the Ministry of Health. They did it on their own. In the case of Sri Lanka, in the case of Thailand, there was coordination, there was consultation, there was cooperation. So what should it be? It's mainly ad hoc because they will not be involved in voter registration. They will not be involved in cleaning the voters list after that. So it's more of an ad hoc arrangement. Is Mr. Rafael Pintor the great author in the many books published by the IPU, International Parliamentary Union. I've read some of your writings, Mr. Pintor. Nice to meet you.
Very
Indeed.
nice to meet you. Very nice to meet you. Yeah, I wrote something about that organization some years ago.
Okay, I see.
And I read a lot about ANFREL and the great job. Actually, you were pioneers in the...
Yes, yes. No, I mean, NAMFREL, that is NAMFREL, the first word. Yes, yes.
Then became ANFREL. Yeah,
Yes,
because
yes.
the
Yeah,
Philippine...
the UNFREL is the regional one. NAMFREL is my organization in Manila.
Yes, yes.
And we are
That was-
pioneers indeed.
Yeah, that was your apostolic effort that you became from the N to the A. Now,
Yeah.
federation, which is great, actually.
That's right. We are now in 144 countries. I mean, election observers.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
I'm
you.
very happy that we are able to connect you two here on this platform. Maybe, yeah, if you would like to touch on that last question on the engagement between health authorities and EMBs from your perspective as last.
That's Nadia you're calling? Nadia?
No, I'm waiting for Hadia. I'm not sure if it's
Okay.
So okay, she's asking if you can repeat the question, please.
sure. The question was, what does she see as an observer organization, the relationship between health agencies like WHO or national health agencies with electoral authorities? Is there a systemic partnership? Is it ad hoc? Does she see this happening in the Arab states region?
For us, there's an integrated relationship between all of these organizations, regardless of the elections. In LAS, we have a lot of partnership with other organizations that work under this secretariat, but these organizations work with some conditions that are defined by specific administration called the administration of the Economic and Social Council or the management of organizations. This administration defines the scope of work in which the LAS work with other organizations. So it has like some conditions, some terms, and a lot of things. Like it's not any organization can have cooperation or can be under the umbrella of LAS unless they have a specific process and specific conditions to be in coordination and in cooperation with LAS.
Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions. I think we're coming to the end of our webinar. Hadia, do you want to add something else?
I would like just to clarify one thing pertaining the booklets that I think Mr. Hisham asked about the methodology of LAS. Of course, we have a manual for LAS that contains the legal framework and the studies of LAS during practicing their tasks and duties from the beginning. And just like any circle, starting from receiving the invitation and until the final report, all of this was in the booklet, and I think it was disseminated in the first forum and also in the second one. I would like also to notify that within the activities of our administration, we have a forum that is organized together with UNDP each 2 years. The first forum was in 2016 and the second one was in 2018, and it was supposed to have another forum in 2020, but due to COVID-19, we delayed any events, we delayed all the events, just like any other organization. So hopefully, with God's will, we will have this forum, and we could have it even in a virtual methodology, because we don't want to stop our events and activities, because if things are going to continue like this, we cannot stop our activities. We need to overcome those challenges, but like any other organization, we have a manual, our own manual. It's been our manual for years now. And as for the procedures or conditions for elections pertaining COVID-19 and the period of COVID-19, we still don't have a manual for it, specifically for it, but we can add it for any other manual out of our experience in our elections. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The forums are a great venue to bring our friends together from the region. For sure, we should discuss how to do it virtually. I mean, this webinar is proving to be an effective way of bringing people together. But we are now at the end of our session. Again, we apologize for losing our third speaker, but we had a fantastic panel of 2 speakers, very informative and insightful. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thank you again, Jamie, for joining us so late from Manila. Hadia, thank you from Cairo. I know you've been in the midst of this observation mission. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Rafael, for jumping in whenever needed. Colleagues, thanks for joining from all over the world. Please follow us on Twitter for updates, including the date of the next webinar, which will be the first week of September. You can watch the recording of this webinar and all previous ones on YouTube. Bye for tonight. Thank you very much.